Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Following today's program, I'll provide you with a brief update on upcoming programs. And also next week, after Dan's usual program, we will host a special members-only discussion session with Dan immediately following his program. So if this sounds of interest to you, please consider becoming a member and join today. For those of you who are new and want to ask questions of Dan, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type in your questions, and Jessica DeGanzik will manage our questions during the Q&A portion of today's program in about 30 minutes. Dan, it's time for me to bring you on. You have a heavy load of questions and a heavy news cycle here.
Yes, from Moscow to Minneapolis. We have a lot to cover today.
Just in geography alone. Dan's three questions today are, number one, after Minneapolis, what we've learned from George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. Second, Biden versus Putin, dealing with the growing Russia challenge. And third, how big should the Supreme Court be? Dan, thank you so very much as usual. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks all of you for being with us here today for another installment in our ongoing series, which has now been going for roughly 13 months since the shutdown last March. And as always, we're very grateful to all of you for joining us. I want to welcome back today one of our most loyal participants, Greta Cohen of White Plains, New York, wasn't with us last week. She had a bit of a difficult week, but I know she's feeling better this week. And Aunt Greta, as always, I'm really, really glad that you're here with us, and I'm very glad that you're feeling better. Anyway, on to our topics, and we're going to start with the word we're waiting for to come out of Minneapolis from the jury there sometime, hopefully in the next day or so. Yesterday, of course, were the closing arguments in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis police officer who's charged with second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter in last summer's death of George Floyd. There are thousands of National Guard troops on the streets of Minneapolis today, as there have been for some time. There have been protests in that city every night for weeks. Minneapolis public schools are closing on Wednesday and will be closed at least through the end of the week, or until it's determined that students can be out safely again. And in the last several days, to take a very tense situation and make it even more difficult, there have been police shootings in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, which is just outside of Minneapolis, and more recently of a 13-year-old boy in Chicago, Illinois. Cities around the country, New York, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, here in Los Angeles, and other cities are preparing for violence depending on the verdict that comes down. President Biden has referred to the overwhelming evidence in the case, although he was careful not to say specifically what he thought the verdict should be. Even the National Basketball Association has been talking with its teams, its players, its coaches, and its owners about the responses they might offer in the situation they might face should a not guilty verdict be delivered. Well, I'm not going to try to predict either the trial verdict, except to note that convincing 12 jurors of anything beyond a reasonable doubt is not easy. Nor am I going to try to predict the likelihood of violence should there be a not guilty verdict. But our program is about politics in the time of coronavirus. So I'll offer a few other thoughts as to what might come next. Well, first of all, on a policy front, the Biden administration's Attorney General, Merrick Garland, made an announcement last week that he was reversing the Trump administration's decision on what's known as consent decrees. And consent decrees, of course, are the actions that the Justice Department can take to make it much easier to the actions that Justice Department can take to require local law enforcement to make changes in their approach to policing. Under then Attorney General Jefferson Sessions, the Trump administration made it much more difficult for the Justice Department to implement these consent decrees and weigh in on matters of local law enforcement. Garland has reversed that decision, and that has profound implications going forward for the federal government's role in working with local police departments and other local and county law enforcement operations. Even more important, though, in the long term, is the prospect of policy reform in the form of legislation. Over the last months, more than 140 state and local laws have been passed around the country, addressing such issues as mandated body cameras, no-knock warrants, officer immunity and liability, and neck restraints, also known as chokeholds. But the key at the federal level in Congress is the George Floyd Act, which was sponsored by Representative Karen Bass of Los Angeles last year. And she and Republican Senator Tim Scott, the only African-American Republican in the United States Senate, have been working for months to try to find common ground between her bill and actually somewhat similar legislation that Senator Scott proposed last year. Now, there are two big differences between where Karen Bass and most Democrats are and where Senator Tim Scott and many Republicans are on these issues. And the two big differences, there are several others, but the two most challenging ones are, number one, on the question of chokeholds, and number two, on the question of officer immunity and liability. And I'm going to talk about each one for just a minute or two before we bring you into the conversation with our first question. Now, the difference on chokeholds, first of all, no one is in favor of a police officer choking a suspect. But the definition is slightly different, and I'm actually going to read the definitions to you in order to demonstrate why there ought to be common ground on a more normal political landscape for this kind of legislative negotiation. The GOP bill, the Republican bill, calls for, quote, bans on physical maneuvers that restrict an individual's ability to breathe for the purposes of incapacitation, unquote. The GOP bill calls for bans on physical maneuvers that restrict an individual's ability to breathe for the purposes of incapacitation. The Democratic bill calls for bans on, quote, application of any pressure to the throat or windpipe, the use of maneuvers that restrict blood or oxygen flow to the brain, or carotid artery restraints that prevent or hinder breathing or reduce intake of air of an individual, unquote. And yes, Aunt Greta, I did read those. I didn't have those memorized. Now look, people who specialize in these kind of questions can come to reasonable disagreements on whether the physical maneuver that restricts an individual's ability to breathe or the application of any pressure to the throat or windpipe is a preferable course of action. But I read those two definitions aloud, again, to illustrate to you that the two sides really aren't all that far apart on this question. Similarly, on questions of police liability or the immunity that many government officials get, including police officers, from lawsuit by civilians, the differences there are a bit more obvious, but also, it seems to me, very negotiable. Karen Bass's bill, the George Floyd Act, says that officers, individual police officers, should be liable if they're found to have acted inappropriately, violently or otherwise, toward a suspect or a member of the community. Senator Tim Scott's bill comes at this question slightly differently. He argues that most police officers don't make a lot of money, and holding them liable would not really result in much in the way of financial compensation for the victim or the victim's family. He instead says that the police department or the municipality ought to face liability for those actions. And he argues that by making a police department financially liable for officer bad behavior, that that's a much more effective way of changing the culture of a police department and ultimately changing the behavior of individuals. Now, once again, reasonable people can disagree on the best way to apply these liability standards. But once again, these are not insurmountable differences. And the question for us to consider is whether the two parties are willing to put in the time to find common ground, or whether they'd rather have this issue to run on next year. And the other question to consider is whether President Biden himself, who strongly supports Bass's bill, will involve himself directly in the negotiations in order to achieve the 60 votes he'll need in the Senate in order to turn this into law. So with that, let's go finally. Let's go to our first question for all of you. And thank you, Claire. What do you think? Will police reform legislation pass Congress this year? 1, yes, meaningful reform of police departments will become law. Meaningful reform. Option 2, yes, a bill will pass, but it'll be a watered down compromise, maybe not all that strong. 3rd, the bill won't pass because the Republicans won't be willing to compromise because they want to use this issue in the next election. Or 4th, no, it won't pass because the Democrats will refuse to compromise to use the issue in the next election. Let's see what we get. And Claire, maybe we should have put a 5th option saying both parties would refuse to compromise. But maybe this way forces people to choose. 52%, more than half of you, believe that a bill will pass, but it'll be a weakened version of the bill. Only 9% of you, less than 1 in 10, think that we're going to achieve meaningful police reform this year, and that's really disappointing. Also worth noting that by a margin of more than 5 to 1, our group thinks that if a bill doesn't pass this year, it'll be because of Republican intransigence rather than Democrats holding out. Now, the politics of police reform are pretty complicated. Republicans see the potential for backlash to aggressive police reform efforts, and they point to the impact of the defund the police debate in last year's election. And there's polling evidence shows that not only their base of conservative voters, but many swing voters, particularly suburbanites and senior citizens, were put off by the message that they heard from many Democrats. But many Democrats see this issue as one that can motivate their base, young people, voters in minority and other underrepresented communities, and other progressives. And they believe that an aggressive response to shootings like that 13-year-old boy in Chicago last week can lead many people who are disillusioned with politics to re-engage and to stand up like they did last summer. Now, it's worth taking a historical perspective on this. Many of you may remember how what many voters saw is the excesses of the 1960s and 70s led to many years of tough on crime legislation, which dominated American politics in the late 20th century, in the 80s and 90s. Politics is like physics. Every action causes an equal reaction. The question isn't whether the cycle will continue. The question is, where are we in the cycle right now between being tough on crime and being more willing to look for other potential alternatives? So let's put up our second question for you. Which party do you think gains more in next year's election from emphasizing the issue of police reform? If both parties talk about this, obviously in very, very different ways, which party makes that issue work for them? Do the Democrats gain because they can point to examples of police violence to motivate their supporters? Do the Republicans gain more because they can point to the so-called defund the police efforts to motivate their supporters and to persuade undecided voters? Both equally, do both parties gain to roughly the same amount by motivating their respective bases on this? Or neither? Are there issues that both parties would rather be talking about? And let's see our responses here. How about that? No wonder we were all, this group was so skeptical about meaningful police reform, because 52% of our respondents, more than half, think that both Republicans and Democrats believe that they can motivate their own supporters by having this issue to run on in next year's midterm elections. and the allure of having that issue in order to pick up seats in those key midterms is a pretty strong one. And so it follows logically that an interest in having that issue would lead to the lack of prospect for significant reform this year. This is an issue that's not going away, of course, and we'll come back to it regularly throughout the year and during the midterm election year also. But for now, let's move on and let's talk about Russia. For those of you who didn't see the news this morning, this very morning, the US ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, announced he'll be leaving Russia under significant pressure from that country's government, and he'll be returning to Washington, D.C. temporarily. Originally, just last night, Sullivan had let it be known that the Russians were trying to pressure him to leave. They were not requiring him to, but were pressuring him to. And originally, Sullivan had resisted the request. But now he's agreed, as of this morning, to return to Washington to consult with administration officials. And I'll simply say that when an ambassador leaves the country to which they've been assigned, that's never a good sign about the state of relationships between those two countries. Now, two things in particular happened on the US-Russia front last week that are of particular importance. First is military. Russia has continued to mass tens of thousands of their troops at the eastern border of Ukraine. They've more than doubled their troop presence there in the last few weeks, and at current rates will more than triple the number of troops they had at the Ukraine-Russia border earlier this year. In addition, Russia is now deploying military vessels, warships, into the Black Sea to increase pressure on Ukraine's shipping lanes. In other words, using the prospect of military influence to affect Ukraine's economy. The second thing that's worth noting is that late last week, President Biden imposed very impactful sanctions on Russia, primarily for their interference in US elections in 2016 and 2020, and their very aggressive efforts to infiltrate and damage our nation's most sensitive computer systems. Now, Ukraine first. When Russia invaded Crimea, the Ukrainian region on the Russian border, when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, they wanted to establish absolute control over that region. But unlike the 2014 invasion, it doesn't appear that Vladimir Putin actually wants to take control of these regions of Ukraine. First, it's expensive to have your military occupy another country, and he's stretched pretty thin right now. And second, there's not the same type of a strategic advantage for Russia that comes with occupying this region. And most importantly, given the economic strains of COVID, it's unlikely the Russian public would respond as favorably now as it did to the Crimea takeover 7 years ago. But if Putin, by encouraging pro-Russian nationalist sentiment in the disputed region, Putin would be creating a real governing challenge for Ukraine in that part of their country. And what that would do is it would weaken internal loyalty among Ukrainian voters in the face of future Russian aggression. It would also represent pretty serious domestic opposition to Ukraine joining NATO, which Putin really doesn't want to happen. Now, even more importantly, on a broader scale, Putin appears to be testing the state of the relationship between the United States and Europe, which was greatly weakened, of course, during the Trump administration. Biden wants to rally Europe to stand with the United States, to stand up to Putin. But Germany is in the process of completing a gas pipeline with Russia. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, who's becoming the most influential leader in Europe as Angela Merkel nears retirement, Macron's much less interested in closely coordinating US and Europe military and security coordination. So Putin wants to see how much progress Biden has made in rebuilding that relationship. Think of this as Putin moving a pawn early in a chess match to draw out his opponent. Now then you have Biden's sanctions, which are noteworthy as well for a few reasons. First, countries usually don't treat cyber spying, online espionage, as that big of a deal. Most countries feel this goes on all the time, just like the types of more traditional spycraft that most nations practice against each other. It's just another form of espionage that just happens to be done online. But the Russian online aggression was so sweeping, and the potential damage done to sensitive US systems was so great that it made Biden take an unusually aggressive counteraction with these sanctions. And it's pretty clear to Biden, even beyond cybersecurity, that Biden wanted to send a very stark message to Russia and the rest of the world that the Trump era is over and that the US is going to push back much more forcefully against Russia in the future. But the Russian election interference in both 2016 and 2020 was a key motivator for Biden too, for both substantive reasons and for messaging purposes. Last week, as you may have read, US intelligence released information that the government had made public for the first time, asserting that internal Trump campaign material had been passed from members of Trump's senior campaign team to a Russian agent, who then in turn passed them on to Russian intelligence agencies. So these sanctions are designed as a message to Putin that his interference is unacceptable, as opposed to the way that Trump has responded to these types of things during his presidency. One other thing that's worth noting is that Biden's new sanctions did not include any reference to the supposed bounties that Russia had been accused of putting on US troops in Afghanistan last year. After all that noise and controversy last year, US intelligence now says that their evidence of that bounty program was not strong enough to be actionable. In other words, they're not really sure whether it happened or not. So on that one of two things is going on. Either Trump was right to hold back and not push back hard against the Russians for this bounty program, or alternatively, Biden does have more information that has been made public, and he's intending to wait until he and Putin are face to face before he acts on that. But I've got a broader question for all of you. And Claire, if you can help me out here. By becoming more aggressive and more combative in his public declarations about Putin, will Biden's approach lead to a change in Russian behavior? What do you think? Will it bring major change? Will it bring minor change? No, it won't bring Russian change, but it'll help US strengthen its relationships with Europe, which have been so dramatically weakened. Or fourth, finally, nope, this won't make any difference at all. Putin's going to do what he's going to do, and it doesn't matter what Biden says in return. Wow, look at that. Only 2% of you think that major change is going to come as a result of Biden's approach on this. Less than a quarter think any change is going to happen at all. But 67% of you believe that even if it doesn't change Russian behavior, 2/3 of you believe it will help strengthen the US relationship with Europe, which in Joe Biden's mind and the minds of his team members means that it is worth doing. Now, Biden's a cold warrior. He was in the Senate for the better part of 2 decades before the Berlin Wall fell, and he's had extensive dealings with the Soviets over those. He had extensive dealings with the Soviets over those years. He's already referred to Putin as a killer, and he's now proposed that the two men meet in a summit in a third country later this year. And Biden's not letting up. His national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, on Sunday issued a threat to the Russian government that there would be serious repercussions to the country's relationship if Russia does not take steps to ensure the health of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. And Sullivan made it very clear how strong those repercussions would be if Navalny does not survive. And as I've mentioned to you before, it's worth remembering that Biden is the first US president in half a century not to promise a better relationship with Russia upon taking office. So if that summit happens between Biden and Putin, it could be historic. So let's move on finally, and we'll spend a few minutes on the question of the potential expansion of the Supreme Court. President Biden announced recently that he was going to appoint a commission to study reform and restructuring of the Supreme Court. And last week, congressional Democrats announced legislation that would specifically expand the court from 9 justices to 13 justices. So what do you think about this? Is this a good idea? Should the court be bigger? Got 4 options here too. Yes, the size of the Supreme Court should be increased because it's the only way to stop conservative court from making improper changes. Yes, the court ought to be increased, but not for ideological reasons, but simply because the country's too big and complicated for 9 justices to handle. Alternatively, no, you don't think the court ought to be expanded. You think that the tradition of 9 justices should not be violated, even though that's not a number that's existed from the beginning of the Republic. It's been in place for quite some time now, and maybe we should respect that tradition. Or finally, 4th, no, we shouldn't add justices, not for philosophical reasons, but for more practical reasons. Because if the Democrats add more justices now, then Republicans will add even more justices when they have control. Quite a split here. Look at this. About just over 60% of you don't believe the court ought to be, size of the court ought to be increased, but not that much of a difference. Only slightly more of you think it should not be increased because of tradition, and slightly less of you think it shouldn't be increased because the Republicans will just do the same thing when the Democrats are out of power. Only a quarter of you want to expand the court for philosophical reasons, and even less than that, only 14% say that this ought to be done for ideological reasons. Now, I read a great column last week by Ruth Marcus, the Washington Post columnist that I'd recommend, in which Marcus argues, she says that most progressives who want to increase the size of the court, she believes, want to do so not because they think there ought to be more than 9 justices, but because they just don't happen to like these 9 justices. But it looks like with our group, at least, ideology is less of a driver than more substantive reasons for the decision. Now, why aren't we spending much time on this? Well, because it's unlikely to happen. This is a reflection of any number of issues on which there's tension between Biden, who's announced his skepticism to the idea of court expansion in the past. This is one example of several points of tension between Biden and more progressive members of his own party. The White House announced today that it was supporting DC statehood, following in line with what the congressional Democrats have been calling for. Differences on the filibuster, on climate change, on immigration. So by naming the commission, Biden is trying to mend some fences with his own party, but it's unlikely to happen. Nancy Pelosi has said she doesn't see this legislation coming up for a vote in the House. And Dick Durbin, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, says he doesn't see his committee dealing with it either. But before we go to your questions, there's one other topic that's percolating. There's one other option that's percolating in the area of Supreme Court reform or restructuring. And that's the idea of imposing term limits on federal judges. And for the Supreme Court, at least, setting up a rotation so that every 2 years, a justice would step down from the Supreme Court, and the president would name a new member. And so each justice would serve 18 years, which means that every president's term would include 2 Supreme Court appointments, and we would eliminate the unpredictability of justices deciding to step down or passing away. And it would become a more institutional part of a presidential campaign in which candidates said, if I'm elected president, these are the types of people, or these are the 2 people who I would appoint if elected. Let's see what you think about that option. What do you think of a rotation for judges, for Supreme Court justices? Option 1, no, we have a tradition of lifetime appointments on the bench, and that shouldn't be violated. No, we shouldn't impose term limits because we'll lose great wisdom if justices are forced to retire before they're ready to. Or alternatively, yes, this is a good idea because it would eliminate the uncertainty I was talking about a moment ago, and it would allow for appointments every 2 years on a more predictable basis. Or yes, we should do this because over time, it would gradually provide more ideological balance to the court if Republican and Democratic presidents had an equal chance to appoint justices. What do we think on this one? Wow. 84% of our respondents believe that term limits in that 18-year rotation for justices does make sense. 84%, that's an immense number. And this is going to be something that's going to be difficult to pull off because while Congress can expand the size of the Supreme Court on its own, it would require a constitutional amendment to institute the type of term limits and type of rotation that we just talked about. But very, very interesting to see how strongly all of you feel about this. That's the most lopsided response to a question we've had in several weeks. Something worth keeping in mind as this discussion goes forward. With that, though, let's see if I can convince Jessica to join us. It's 11:30 in California, the bottom of the hour. And Jessica, I'm wondering if anybody has sent in any questions for us to discuss.
Yes, they have. And for anyone who hasn't sent in questions, you can do so. There's a control panel on the right-hand side, and there's a question section if you'd like to send yours in. And we will just start right here at the top. So what is the likelihood of a mistrial in the Derek Chauvin case, especially given POTUS and Representative Waters' statements?
So really two questions in that. What is the possibility of a mistrial? And number two, I think a broader question about the comments that both Joe Biden and Maxine Waters have made about the case in recent days. Before I answer, and Jessica, I know you know this, but for all of our participants, it is now about 1:30 p.m. in Minneapolis, and the presiding judge has already made it clear that he will not announce the results of jury deliberations toward the end of a day in order to avoid the potential for violence overnight. So if we're going to hear news today, it's probably going to be in the next few hours. And if we hear it in the next 30 minutes, of course, we'll pass it on to you. We'll pass it on to you right away. I don't think the likelihood of a mistrial is great. The judge generally has been very careful, unusually careful, I should say, in his administration of the trial to avoid situations that would lead to a mistrial. And although President Biden and to a greater extent Representative Waters have made comments either hinting or very strongly stating their opinion on the case, the judge said yesterday, the judge actually rejected the defense's request for a mistrial as a result of Representative Waters' statements and said that her comments might provide grounds for appeal for the losing side if Officer Chauvin is found guilty, but he did not think a mistrial was in order. Larger conversation ahead should our group decide that they'd like to have it about the appropriateness of their comments. My own feeling is that Biden walked right up to the edge. He said there was overwhelming evidence, but didn't quite say this is how I hope the trial will turn out. And it's been reported that the White House is already planning that Biden will address the nation, particularly if Chauvin is found not guilty. Waters' comments are trickier, and there's a lot of whataboutism going on. Republicans who found way to excuse inflammatory comments earlier this year in the aftermath of the election, now very harshly condemning Representative Waters for her comments about the trial, and Democrats who were outraged by the types of comments made by Republicans earlier this year, finding ways to defend her. My own opinion is that the kind of language that Representative Waters used is not appropriate from either Democrats or Republicans. And whether she intended to encourage violence, and she's made it very clear that she did not, or whether she intended to encourage violence or not, it's entirely likely that there'll be at least some people who will take her words that way, just as there were people who took President Trump's and other Republicans' words that way earlier this year. I'm not trying to equate the two. I'm just simply saying that both sides need to be fairly careful in their use of language, particularly in such a potentially incendiary situation. And it's a frustrating reminder of where our politics is today, that most voices on both sides of the aisle tend to be engaging in situational outrage on these types of things, rather than deservedly calling out excessive language on both sides of the aisle, whether it happens to be on your side or not.
How can Biden call for peace if Chauvin is acquitted after his statement?
Biden, as I mentioned earlier, did not actually come out and say that he believed that Chauvin ought to be convicted. But he obviously hinted in that direction pretty heavily. And I suspect that the fact that he did not make a categorical statement in the minds of the president and his advisors still gives him the ability to address the nation, perhaps not as a completely neutral observer, but as someone who maybe has greater standing in the eyes of those who would be most upset by a not guilty verdict to appeal to them. In other words, Biden didn't say, I think he should go free, but by implying it, it might make it easier to go back to those who would be inclined toward protest or worse after the verdict is issued. Yeah, we talked earlier this year about the challenge Biden has about wanting to stay on message, about wanting to focus his attentions on COVID and on the economy, even if it means not devoting a great deal of time and attention to really important issues like gun violence and like immigration. Well, this trial and this coming verdict is one more example that even the President of the United States doesn't get to control the agenda. And as much as he'd rather be talking about COVID and the economy and infrastructure, he's almost certainly going to have to talk about police violence a lot more in the days ahead than he has in the past.
Do you think LA Police Chief Michael Moore has sufficiently retrained his officers to handle demonstrations and riots since the summer disturbances in Los Angeles?
Well, I mentioned earlier in the program today that it's not just Minneapolis that is bracing for the potential of protests, if not for violence. And there's no question that Los Angeles faced one of the most difficult challenges in that regard this summer after the death of Mr. Floyd. Chief Moore says that his officers are much better prepared now than they were last summer. He says that he has adjusted potential problems in the chain of command so it's more clear who will be making minute-by-minute decisions on the ground for the police department. And so I am confident that the LAPD has been, and local law enforcement across the country has been working as hard as possible to prepare for any eventuality that will take place in the days ahead. That said, as confident as I am in their preparations, I'm equally confident that no agency, law enforcement, or other can prepare for any circumstance. And so no matter how much better prepared a police department is today than they were 6, 7, 8, 9 months ago, there are going to be unforeseen eventualities, and it's going to put those departments to the test. We talked about this in the aftermath of George Floyd when we gathered last summer. All I can say is that for anyone who may be tempted to go out and join a protest or a rally, if the verdict does not come down to your preference, all I can say is please, please, please maintain your street presence to daylight hours. And when the sun goes down, if there are small numbers of people who are intent on causing trouble, don't let yourself be used as cover for them. And so if law-abiding citizens who want to make their voices heard in a peaceful way do so during daylight hours and then retreat from the streets at nightfall, it'll make it much more difficult for that very small number of troublemakers to cause the difficulties that caused so much anguish last summer and could again now.
Please refresh our memory whether the Bass or Scott bill includes provisions of registry of police officers with problems. Wouldn't this have more significant impact on the culture of police because if they get fired or reprimanded, they cannot readily find another police job.
So both the Bass and the Scott, well, the Scott bill no longer exists, but both Democrats and Republicans do agree that enhanced data collection and availability of officer misconduct is important. So that is not a point of disagreement between the two sides. There is a disagreement on how that ought to be accomplished, but as was the case with the chokeholds, as is the case with the liability questions, the fact that both sides do want expanded data collection and dissemination suggests to me that the differences on the apparatus and the means by which it's done are surmountable obstacles as well if the two parties really want to do so.
We're going to pivot to Russia here a bit. How much stock do you put in Putin's joining the Biden summit on climate change today? Does it show a certain ability to work with Russia selectively, or is it just for show on Putin's part?
Probably both. And I'd make the same point about the US-China dialogues on climate change. Biden's made it very clear that climate change is such a seminal issue, such a critical threat, that even if there are serious disagreements with China and Russia on other issues, that should not preclude cooperation on climate-related matters. But neither China nor Russia seems particularly incentivized to move forward on this front in an aggressive way. I hope I'm wrong about that. I don't know that whether either Russian or Chinese leaders will try to show Biden up, but my expectations about aggressive action on either country's part are somewhat minimal. And what I should say, to be fair to those skeptics around the world, not just in China or Russia, but in many, many other countries who would have to make very difficult sacrifices in order to achieve necessary climate change goals, some of the skepticism about US leadership is understandable, given what I'll say diplomatically has been the uneven nature of our country's involvement in these global efforts. This will be the second time that the US has re-entered has retaken a leadership role in negotiations after withdrawals in the past. I think most of the world understands that Biden is much more committed to the progress on this front than Trump was, but they also recognize how closely divided our country and our Congress is. And they also recognize that it's entirely possible that 3.5 years from now, another American president could be elected who doesn't share Biden's commitment to the issue. So a little bit of leeriness, not just on the part of our detractors, but our allies, is somewhat understandable. And I should follow up that this will obviously be one of our 3 topics next week, with President Biden hosting the Global Climate Change Summit this Thursday and Friday. It's been a while since we've talked about the issue, so let's make sure that next week it become one of our 3 topics for discussion.
Sounds good. As a follow-up to what you were just saying, how can we really cope with Russia when Putin is president for life and our policies zigzag as a function of every presidential election?
Well, the argument is one that Biden is working very, very hard to push back on. And that argument at its core is that democracy is simply either a less efficient or less effective means of governance than a more authoritarian approach. Well, as we know, democracy is the least efficient form of government. But one of the things that Biden has been talking about since taking office, not just when it comes to foreign policy, but when it comes to domestic policy too, is attempting to prove to the world that the democratic system can take on these issues in a meaningful way. So does that mean that there's less consistency in a democratic country than in an authoritarian government? Of course, it means that. On the other hand, it also means a much broader range of voices are being heard in policy and political discussion in this country than are the case in Russia or China or elsewhere. So democracy has its disadvantages. One of Biden's greatest challenges as president is to remind the world audience of its advantages too.
What is the scenario where the US and or NATO would send in troops to stop a Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Boy, this is a very difficult challenge for Biden, and we've talked about this on the Pacific Rim as it relates to a potential as it relates to potential aggressive action on the part of China in Taiwan. And the challenge for Biden or for any American president of either party at this point in history is our country's isolationist instincts have been growing stronger and stronger in recent years. And convincing the people of this country, convincing the voters of this country that U.S. military troops ought to be put in harm's way in order to defend Ukraine or Taiwan is somewhat of a challenge. And this is what both Russian and Chinese leadership are gambling on right now, that if they take these partial steps forward, gauge America's public and political reaction, and try to guesstimate in advance how far they can go, because Putin correctly calculates that there's not going to be a lot of appetite in this country for U.S. military involvement in that part of the world. If Russia were to become even more aggressive, like I said, it doesn't seem like Putin wants to occupy additional Ukrainian territory as much as he wants to weaken the Ukrainian government and test the U.S.-European relationship. But if at some point more forceful military action were taken, my best guess is that the response would not be a unilateral military response from the United States, for which there'd be very little public support, but rather U.S. engagement is part of a multinational force. And this is one of the many reasons that Biden is so committed himself to reestablishing our country's multilateral relationships with our allies, not only for diplomatic and for economic reasons, but for potential military and security reasons too. So unlikely that you would see a direct U.S.-Russia conflict there, much more likely that you would see a multinational presence, either through NATO or some other body, to protect and support the Ukrainians.
This question's from our mutual friend, Bob Waldorf. How does the closer relationship between Russia and China affect Biden's relationship with Russia?
It creates yet an additional challenge. And I mentioned one of our loyal audience members at the beginning of the program today, but let's agree that Bob and Toby Waldorf are two of our favorite and most consistent participants as well. So not surprisingly, really smart question, Bob. And the answer is it makes a very complicated challenge for Biden even more challenging, because both Russia and China in themselves create tremendous geopolitical difficulties for this country and for Biden and his advisors. If the two of them are working in concert, the complication becomes much greater, because it creates a situation where the two countries can reinforce each other's interests. China is a nation, obviously, of much, much greater, not just population, but much, much greater economic potential than Russia has or ever will have. So China would be in a position to support Russia economically should that ever become necessary. On the flip side, particularly under Putin, Russia has been much more aggressive in its, I'll say diplomatically, its outreach beyond its own borders, whether in the Middle East, whether in Eastern Europe, or elsewhere. And for China, which generally speaking doesn't like to get its hands dirty in those types of endeavors, it would be relatively easy to rely on Russia intervention to save China the complications of getting more directly involved on a military basis. We've talked about this before, because of course the great historical irony is back in the 1970s, Richard Nixon originally reached out to China primarily as a way of creating an additional leverage point against the Soviet Union. And now what we're seeing almost half a century later is Russia and China coming to the same conclusion about their own relationship that Nixon did when he opened up China back in his second term in office.
Are Biden's sanctions against Russia about foreign policy or domestic politics, aka meat for his base?
I don't know that Biden's base is all that motivated by questions related to Russia. So it does seem to me that this is, while he's certainly communicating to a domestic U.S. audience, the primary audience for these sanctions, at least the message behind these sanctions, is an international audience. The interference in U.S. elections is something that upsets voters in this country, but it's not about vote motivator. The infiltration and damage to U.S. computer systems is something that when most voters are asked about here, they don't like, but once again, not particularly something that's vote determinative. I suspect this is something on Biden's part much more designed to send a message to the rest of the world that the U.S. is going to push back harder against Russia than it did over the previous 4 years. And even more importantly than the message it sends to Europe and China and to the rest of the world is the message it sends to Russia and to Putin. By the way, real quickly, just to correct myself before we start getting angry emails, I mentioned Nixon's outreach to China in his first term in office, and I should correct myself and mention that that's something that on which he worked throughout his time as president.
Thank you. How do you think Biden will fare at a prospective summit with Putin, given the appearance that Biden is slowing down with age?
Well, you may remember that early this year, shortly after Biden took office, Putin challenged him to a debate. And that was clearly something that neither Biden himself or his advisors were particularly thrilled about doing, either because of the elevated platform it would give Putin, but also because that kind of dynamic might not play as well to Biden's communications skills. A summit, though, at least in public, is a fairly controlled environment. The real test for both men would be in private. And even if you accept the premise that Biden is operating maybe half a step slower than you did 10 years ago, he's not alone in a room with Vladimir Putin. There's any number of advisors of both leaders in the room also. So at least in terms of public presentation, I don't think that Biden's age would be that relevant. I think what would be much more impactful, even if he does have an unsteady moment or two in public, is the display of an American president pushing back on Putin much more forcefully than his president did. So the risk is minimal, but I think the payoff is much greater. The question now is whether Putin will accept the offer or not.
Do you have any remarks about Fritz Mondale? This questioner says, I attended Carleton College in the early 80s, was a student of Paul Wellstone, and heard Mondale speak at St. Olaf at that time. Thank you.
Oh, well, if nothing else, Jessica, we should find a way to track down the questioner, because I attended Carleton College in the early 1980s. And while I did not attend Vice President Mondale's speech at St. Olaf College, it sounds like the questioner and I were there at the same time. I think the passing of a notable American leader in either party, a Walter Mondale, a John McCain, a George H.W. Bush, a Ted Kennedy, I think is a time to put aside partisan differences and offer our respects not just to the passing of an individual, but respect those individuals regardless of their party leanings or ideology who gave their lives to public service. I didn't agree with Walter Mondale on a lot of things, probably a lot less than most of my friends at Carleton College back in the 80s did. In fact, my first experience in politics, as I think many of you know, was working on Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign against Walter Mondale. And when I went to sleep finally on election night, Reagan had more than 400 electoral votes. Mondale had 3. And I used to joke that was only 3 more than I had. But I say that not out of disrespect to Walter Mondale, but just to say in the heat of partisan combat, we can get carried away not just with our ideas, our policy preferences, and our ideology, but much more frequent now than in the 1980s, come to decide that the people who disagree with us are not honorable opponents, but are evil or stupid. And so when a time like this comes for a Mondale, for a McCain, for a Kennedy, for a Bush, I think it is worth noting that these men and women gave their lives for public service and whether or not we happen to agree with them on particular matters of legislation is not nearly as important as honoring them for their service at the time of their passing, and if we're smart enough, hopefully before they pass as well.
Thank you. Is there still hope that anything the West is doing now will save Navalny from death?
Boy, any number of countries have demanded that Navalny be released. That's not likely to happen. The threat issued by National Security Advisor Sullivan over the weekend sends a pretty important message to the Russians, though, that we consider the Russian government to be responsible for his health, whether they think that's the case. Does that mean that he'll receive an appropriate level of medical care? Not necessarily, but it increases the pressure on Russia, and reminds them once again, just as the sanctions do, just as the debate over Ukraine does, that this president is not going to be nearly as accommodating as his predecessor when it comes to what he believes to be Russian misbehavior. So I don't know what's going to force the type of profound change that Mr. Navalny deserves, whether or not, again, you happen to agree with his politics. The man certainly deserves appropriate medical care in order to live. But it's still an important message for the U.S. and its allies to send, not only on Mr. Navalny's behalf, but as the relationship between the two superpowers continues to progress or regress.
Is Biden receptive to term limits for justices?
I haven't heard him make a comment on that, and I would have to check. As I mentioned earlier, I know he's been skeptical in the past about expanding the court, but he was willing to announce a commission. And what's interesting about his announcement is that commission wasn't designed specifically to look at expanding the court, but at a range of reform options, of which term limits and the rotation we discussed is one of several that seem to be under consideration. And so my guess is that because Biden appointed a commission that allowed for those other options, means he might be somewhat more receptive to something like a term limits on justices, as opposed to simply increasing the size of the court. But I don't know of public comments that he's made on that.
Do you feel that political positions are coming into Supreme Court justices more than in the recent past?
Do I feel that politics are influencing Supreme Court decisions more than in the past? Mm-hmm. Well, I think so, but I don't think that's because the justices are consciously behaving in a more partisan way. And in fact, I think whether you happen to agree with many of his decisions or not, it's worth giving Chief Justice Roberts some credit for his efforts to keep the courts out of as many notably partisan matters as possible. So I would put the fault not on the justices themselves, but rather increasingly presidents of both parties are more and more likely to appoint partisan and ideological compatriots of themselves to the court. And so when you fill the part with partisans, it shouldn't be surprising that they act in a more partisan behavior, in a more partisan way. So I do think the justices are more likely to line up along predictably ideological lines, but that's not because they've made conscious decisions to do so. It's because they were appointed in order to do just that.
This will be our final question, because we're at the end of the hour. This questioner says, speaking of Reagan, there is a recent book, I believe, which focuses on Nancy Reagan, suggesting that she had huge influence on the presidency. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's been underappreciated for many years how much of an influence a first lady or in other countries a first spouse has on a chief executive. It's been reported that Nancy Reagan, that Lady Bird Johnson, no question that Eleanor Roosevelt and any number of other first ladies had important policy impact on their husbands as president. And I have no effect that when our nation has its first female president, that first gentleman will have similar policy impact as well. I think the fact that most first spouses offer their opinions behind closed doors in private conversation is probably appropriate. And the fact that we don't know more details about that until long after their spouse has left office is probably okay. But that's one of the reasons it's always so exciting to read history, is to learn more about those private deliberations than was made public during the time. So am I particularly excited or upset that Mrs. Reagan or Mrs. Johnson played more important policy roles in their husband's government than was reported at the time? Not really, but it's it's exciting to be able to learn about it even years after the fact.
Well, and we're grateful for your wife as well. I know she sometimes is our fact checker and she helps us with technical issues. So we know that these women are behind the scenes doing great stuff. So
speaking of spouse wisdom, absolutely.
Yes, exactly. All right, Dan, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience, and I'll see you next week. Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Jessica, thank you so much. Dan received so many questions. You manage all of them so smoothly, so thank you so much. Dan, you, as always, do such an excellent job of helping us navigate through these most compelling and timely issues. So thank you for your time and expertise, as always.
Well, thank you, Kim. As always, I really enjoy it, as you know.